I'm Michael Freed. I'm the Director of Planet Earth Arts at Stanford. We are now in our 11th year as an adjunct interdisciplinary program that centers the environment and social justice through the lens of the arts and human creativity while we explore the future of all life here on our planet. You're in for quite a journey this evening, and I will just take the liberty that the work that is done here at Stanford and George's work is the antidote to the attack on global civilization that we are currently experiencing. About a month ago, I saw that wonderful movie, I'm Still Here. And at the end of it, I just jumped up and said, this can happen here. We all must fight in whatever way we each can. One of the premier institutes here at Stanford that we've had the pleasure of working with is the Woods Institute. And Chris Field, the director, will be engaged in a very lively conversation as well as a Q&A with you. Chris is the Perry L. McCarthy Director of the Stanford Woods Institute and the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies. He is also a professor of Earth System Science in the Doerr School and a senior fellow at Stanford Court. Prior to his appointment as Woods Director, Field served as director of the Carney Institution for Science's Department of Global Ecology, which he founded in 2002. And his tenure with that institution dates back to 1984. He was also director of that magical Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve here. So it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podium Chris Field, the director of the Woods Institute.
Let me just say that it's a really special privilege to be involved in an event that brings together the arts and the sciences. One of the things that is a real hallmark of Stanford's new Doerr School of Sustainability is the recognition that if we're going to make progress on the key issues that all of us face, we need to do that by mobilizing all of society, engineering, science, health sciences, and especially the arts. And that makes it such a privilege to introduce George Steinmetz this evening. Best known for his aerial photography, George Steinmetz has a restless curiosity for the unknown, remote landscapes, our changing climate, and how we can meet the ever-expanding food needs of humanity. A regular contributor to National Geographic and the New York Times Magazine, he's explored subjects ranging from the remotest stretches of Arabia's empty quarter to the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. In 2006, he was awarded a grant by the National Science Foundation to document the work of scientists in the dry valleys and volcanoes of Antarctica. George has won numerous awards for photography during his 35-year career, including 3 prizes from World Press Photo. He's also won the Environmental Vision Award from Pictures of the Year, a citation from the Overseas Press Club, and was named the National Geographic's Adventurer of the Year in 2008. His most recent accolade was receiving the 2023 Doerr School Distinguished Alumnus Award, presented by Dean Arun Majumdar. His current projects are documenting climate change and the global food supply, primarily with professional drones. My pleasure to present George Steinmetz.
Thank you, Chris. Before I get started tonight, I'd like to acknowledge 2 people in the audience who made it possible for me to be here today. My sister, Julia Breckenridge, is here. Julia, can you raise your hand? And after I spent a couple of years knocking around Africa, I came back penniless, and Julie let me sleep on her sofa for many months when I was trying to get my first job. And also I wanted to thank Michael Fried for bringing me here, and it's really exciting to be back on campus. Michael organized this event, and he's also helped me organize some meetings. I'd like to place my life work, my archive with Stanford, and that's something I'm actively working on, and I want to thank Michael for his help. It's exciting to be back on campus after so many years. I spent decades traveling, and I became a little disconnected, and it was really extraordinary to me when I found out that the old Earth Science Department had been renamed the Doerr School of Sustainability. And to me, it was a case of what biologists call conversion evolution, but on a personal level, because we both traveled through very different pathways to arrive at the same place. This is me during my junior year at Stanford in 1978, when I was a brash geophysics student. And to be honest, I wasn't particularly interested in geophysics. But in my junior year, I had to declare something, and geophysics was the second highest paying major. So I figured it was a good plan B. Most of my fellow students were training for the U.S. Geological Survey or working for oil companies, and that just didn't seem very exciting. And in a kind of a pre-graduation panic, I got a summer job with Texaco, and I saved about $5,000 living with my mother, and I decided to go on a long hitchhiking trip across Africa. And I didn't know anything about Africa, but it was the most different place I could imagine from growing up in Los Angeles. As a kid, we had like National Geographic magazine in the house, and I thought, wow, I'd go and see, lions and tigers. And so I bought a one-way ticket to London, and I hitchhiked down through Sicily, got the ferry across to Tunis, and I stuck my thumb out and took the bus to the edge of Algiers and started heading south. And this is me about 4 months later, when I ran out of rides in the Ituri forest of what was then called Zaire. I thought I would find myself in situations I had seen in the page of National Geographic, so I brought a camera, but I didn't know much about photography. And I mailed a few rolls of film back to my mother every time I hit an African capital. My mom would write me, I get these aerograms back from my mother like 2 months later saying, roll 23, frames 7 and 10 out of focus. And it's like, and we're so spoiled now with digital photography, this like instant gratification, but back then it was a really slow feedback loop. And I traveled it's a long story. I traveled for years, and I got back, and it was really depressing seeing all the pictures that didn't work out, because I had these incredible experiences that were failures. But that's life. You learn from your mistakes. And it was a very different Africa than exists today. There were no asphalt roads, no mobile phones, and no terrorism. Africa for me, it was like graduate school on $10 a day. And I learned how to get around and pick up rudimentary French and a little Arabic from dictionaries and truck drivers. This is me in Uganda, learning Swahili from a book I bought in the market and sipping some palm wine. And Africans are very generous to foreigners, and I was a real oddity, this kind of long, tall, blonde-haired kid from California. And I would arrive in a village, people would invite me in for the night and let me share their meal. It was a wonderful way to learn about Africa on a really grassroots level. And I hadn't studied journalism either, but with my camera soon became an excuse to go and poke my nose into places I had never been before. And I heard about a revolutionary movement in the mountains of Uganda, and there was a self-declared emperor of the Ruwenzori Mountains. So I went to meet him, and he gave me this long manifesto which he addressed to members of the foreign press. But unfortunately for him, that was only me. And I didn't know what a National Geographic photographer did, so I just kind of faked it. And when I got to South Sudan, I had to get a photo permit, and I particularly like the paragraph on the right part of this permit where it says it's forbidden to take pictures of nude persons, because at that time, virtually no one in South Sudan wore any clothes. This is a cattle camp in South Sudan along the banks of the Nile. And I spent a couple weeks in this camp. When I was a student here, I'd taken an anthropology class and read a book about the tribes of the Nilotic tribes of South Sudan, and I was determined to try to document their disappearing way of life. This is a father teaching his son how to tie a cow's tether out of a palm frond, and it just started to rain. It was a passing thunderstorm. But the Dinka had this really incredibly intimate, symbiotic way of life with the cattle, and I was fascinated photographing it. Finally, in South Sudan, I started running out of money, and I had to get home. And the only way out was on the train, and I didn't have money for the train, so I rode on the roof. And when you sleep on the roof, you have to be really careful how you sleep because you don't want to roll off. The other thing that was really awkward was when you had to go to the toilet. I had like 10,000 people watching how the foreigner did it in the bushes. But I really loved the elevated perspective, and it made me start to daydream, like, wouldn't it be amazing if I could get up above the landscape and fly like a bird, if I could visualize like how Africans had reshaped the land and made a living from it. And that dream stuck with me for many years. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes with my paragliding. But when I got back home, I was on my sister's couch for a number of months, and I moved in with some friends in San Francisco. And I had very little money, and I was trying to get a job as a photographer, and nobody wanted to publish exotic pictures of Africa. So I started sending out postcards of myself. These are a kind of paper called coat of bromide, and you actually print on the postcard. And I would get a box, and I mail about 100 out to different photographers with my phone number in the back and a desperate plea to give me a job. And eventually it worked. One of the things I had to learn was how to like pre-visualize a picture. And there were a lot of, it was this really awkward period of time when you think you know more than you do. And I had to fill in the gaps. But eventually I started getting jobs. This is Robert Crumb, the cartoonist. I did a portrait of him for Mother Jones magazine. And a few months later, I got my first magazine cover. This is Linus Pauling, the Stanford professor, and he's the only person ever win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, one for chemistry and one for peace. And he was I find him a little bit difficult to connect with until I told him that I was a kid in Los Angeles. I had a pet boa constrictor named Linus Crawling. and then he smiled, and we got along quite well. And another big break for me, this is Mayor Dianne Feinstein, which is mayor of San Francisco. And the computer industry was just getting started, and Di-Fi didn't know anything about computers, but it was a nice prop on her desk. Made her look like she was really with it. She's a very charming lady. And so I started getting work from business magazines about this new computer industry that was starting up. And one of the people you most liked to photograph at the time was Steve Jobs, who was a very difficult guy to photograph. Because he was very impatient with photographers. He'd give you like maybe 10 minutes. And I had to take pictures in a lot of bad rooms, so here I had to resort to Frankenstein light. But this is Steve with the founders of Pixar, who were starting to make new developments in computer animation. And by the time I worked my way up through the magazine industry, and eventually I got a big break, and I pitched a story to National Geographic about oil exploration. And basically what I pitched them was like I was a Stanford grad, I knew a lot about geophysics, and I also worked in the oil industry. So I could talk oil, and the oil industry is a very secretive business, and I hadn't really thought about it in depth before. But these guys are making the companies are making billion-dollar bets on whether there's going to be oil, and this was drilling a well in the North Sea off the coast of Alaska. And it's very tough to get onto these situations. They're very secret about the well data, and I had to tell them like I didn't want to see their well data. I just wanted to see like the cool technology they use to find oil, and they bought it. I talked my way onto a rig in the North Sea that was flaring. And when you have a really big find like this one, there's nowhere, you have to open up the pipe and to see how fast it'll flow. Before you build a pipeline out to it, you open it up, and this wellhead was flowing at 10,000 barrels a day. And that's a lot of oil. And basically they lit the candle, they burned this thing for about 18 hours and said, yes, proof of field, we'll build a pipeline and we'll get our $1 billion back. But in the life of an oil field, this happens for like 18 hours, like the 20-year life of a field. So it was very, very rare. And the Geographic was impressed that I was able to be successful with this difficult industry. And their ethos at the time was to try to get the kind of pictures of things you'd never seen before. Or if it was something you'd seen before, photograph in a totally different way. And most of the pictures I had seen of oil rigs or oil industry was like, the oil rig at sunset cliche. And I thought, ooh, wouldn't it be cool to photograph one underwater? So I started to look around and made a lot of phone calls, and I found one in the Gulf of Suez. This is off the coast of Egypt. And it was very difficult to get permission to go dive there because I didn't have a commercial diver's license. I I had as a teenager, I got a license to dive off Catalina. And I had to finagle my way onto the rig and get down to the bottom and get underneath the rig to look up. And it was really, fortunately for me, the safety standards in Egypt were not out there on the United States, and the dive master let me go down. The first time with an empty tank, it went empty in the bottom of the ocean. I had to go back up an emergency surface. But I got my photo. And I spent about 2 weeks in this one picture, but for the Geographic, if you could spend 2 weeks and get one picture, it was a great picture, that was worth it. And so I hit it big with my first story, and they started putting me on a fairly regular rotation, and I got to travel the world and see cool stuff. This is Grand Prismatic Pool in Yellowstone, seen from a helicopter. And on most assignments, it was kind of a cliche, but there was an aerial photo, and for me, that was the most fun part. And I really got into photography because it was fun, and so I gravitated to the most fun part of the job. This is Lake Natron in Tanzania, which is a super high pH. It's a hyperbasic lake, and it has this really unusual red color from the salt-loving bacteria that thrive in it. And there was nothing for a scale to use, so I used the shot of the plane that I hired. And another assignment took me out to the edge of the Sahara. This is in Mauritania, where I saw a small chain of camels going across the dunes, and I was really amazed by the austere nature of the desert, and I thought, ooh, I really like to do more work in the desert. And so I proposed a big story to the Geographic on the Sahara. The problem was I couldn't find any aircraft out there, so I had to learn how to fly my own. And this is me flying a motorized paraglider over a lost village in Algeria. The kind of aircraft that I learned how to fly is a motorized paraglider. I call it like a flying lawn chair, and it's the lightest, slowest motorized aircraft in the world. They fly at about 30 miles an hour, and with 10 liters of fuel, you can fly for an hour and a half to 2 hours. The motors are not super reliable. They're kind of like garage jobs. But the beautiful thing about them is if the motor quits, you just glide in for a landing. And out in the desert, you can land almost anywhere and just get on the radio and you tell your crew to come pick you up. And to work out there, we had to have 3 cars, one for the aircraft, one for people, and one for fuel. We had drums of fuel in the back of a pickup truck so we could exist out in the desert for about a week at a time. And the whole thing, the beauty of the paraglider is the whole thing could pack up into like 50-pound bags. And if you get through past the customs man in the African capital, out in the desert, you were golden. You could take off anywhere and fly anywhere you wanted. So I put together a short compilation of videos so you see how my aircraft works. So get this to go. So I got into motorized paragliding in 1997. It's about 15 years before drones. And the sweet spot for the glider was between like 200 and 500 feet, where you can see, it's kind of like where you just take off in a plane and you can look out the window and you can see the cars. You can tell what kind of car it is. You can kind of see the world three-dimensionally. And I love that perspective. Once you get up really high and everything flattens out, that was like airplane stuff. It wasn't so interesting, but I love the kind of three-dimensionality that I got from this 200 to 500 feet. And below that, it gets crazy because you have to fly with your hands off the controls of the aircraft. And if something goes wrong, you're going to be you're going to have an unscheduled landing and get kind of banged up. But it let me visualize things that had never really been seen from the air before. This is 2 camel caravans crossing the middle of Niger. And we found a really big caravan with like maybe 300 or 400 camels. We shouted it with cars for about a week until we saw another one coming. And then I got up in the air and I got the 2 passing. But it gave me flexibility. And I knew the camel guys. I mean, I was spending time with them. So it was like an intimate, more personal kind of aerial photography, which I found really wonderful reporting. And it let me explore parts of the Sahara from the air that had really never been seen before. This is up in northern Chad near the Libyan border. And this area had been mined before, and nobody had been in here for years. And it was just, I was seeing these like really exquisite wildernesses. And it was just, to be able to see something no one had ever seen before, it was super exciting. I felt like I was exploring the moon or something. And so most of the time the gliders go down low, but there are some things that I had to go high for. This is a sunken caldera in the Sahara. It's a volcanic caldera, and it's about 6 kilometers wide. And so to take this, if you look at my altimeter on my left leg, you can see I'm about 5,500 feet above takeoff. And so I took off from the sandy part of the crater. I went like full throttle, higher and higher and higher. And I'm not some like adventure dude. This like scared the shit out of me being up that high. And I was like shaking. And I thought, well, if I'm shaking, if I'm that nervous, it's like, if you're gonna get killed, at least take the picture first, And then so they can pull the camera out. At least you died for something. And if you talk to a pro pilot, they'll tell you that actually altitude is your friend. The higher you are, if you have a problem, you have more time to figure it out on the way down. I figured I just have more time to scream on the way back down. But taking pictures calms me down. I don't fly without a camera. I only fly. I have a lot of friends, paragliding friends, and they'll go out there and fly through arches and buzz villages. I don't do that. I just go up there. I'm kind of like, I'm not a mercenary, but I go out there very purposefully and I take the picture and I get back on the ground. And after I survived the Sahara, I thought, wow, this is really great in deserts. And I'd read Wilfred Thesiger's book about the empty quarter, and I really wanted to go and see Arabian sands. Arabia has the biggest sea of sand in the world. It's bigger than France and Belgium and Holland combined. And there's not a single permanent point of water out there. It's all sand. And it's surreal. It's one of the strangest places I've ever seen. And to navigate out there, I got some old maps from the U.S. Geological Survey that were made in the 1960s. And the yellow you see here are the dunes, and the red is what they call subka. They're like salt flats. And we had to plot our way through here, and it was like a labyrinth because the dunes are too steep to cross with our cars. And so we had to plot our course through it because if you have a dead end, you don't have enough fuel to get back. And the glider was also really useful for navigation. And these are 3 of our cars, again, one for people, one for the aircraft, and one for fuel drums. Anyway, so we were able to see really extraordinary dune forms, things I'd never even seen in the textbooks. This is a barkhan dune that's like spawning baby barkhan dunes. A lot of the stuff I would find, I had the maps from the USGS, and I also contacted a guy at NASA who gave me Landsat data, and I would comb it looking for like really weird patterns of dots. And sometimes you go up with the glider and you look around and you just get lucky and you find stuff. These are camels going out to graze in Oman. This is probably the best picture I'm best known for. And the glider let me get into places that are off limits to most aerial photographers. This is in Libya, and I couldn't get a permission to fly in Libya, but we smuggled the aircraft in across the border from Tunisia. My friend told him that the motor was a generator and the wing was a tent, and he put the propellers under a seat, and we got out in the middle of the desert where there were no cops, and we put it together and went flying. And nobody had ever photographed this place from before. It's called Wal Namus. It looks like a meteor impact site, but it's the volcano came up and it hit some groundwater and it just exploded, and it looks like a 20-mile black scar in the middle of the Sahara. It's a really extraordinary feature. Only one like it in the world. And again, that was for me. That was really what I was getting excited about. I would spend like months preparing for something like that to get that one picture no one had ever seen. We're also able to get into Iran. This is in the Dasht-i-Lut desert near the Afghan border. And I was the first person to fly in Iran, the first foreigner to fly in Iran since the revolution. And I had actually had a permit in Iran. I got a permit. I was worried about, because we have no representation, no embassy representation, and I was really concerned about my own safety. And so we had permits to fly. And not all deserts are hot and dry. I also found some that are hot and wet. And this is in Brazil, where they have a barcan dune field on the coast. And during the rainy season, the hollows between the dunes get flooded with fresh water. And also during the rainy season, the rivers from the rainforest penetrate the dunes with tannin-stained streams. And this is my three Brazilian crew walking through one of the streams that penetrated the dunes. And they're also, I was thinking, I decided to do a book on deserts. I wanted to go to every extreme desert in the world, and a lot of them are actually high altitude deserts. This is in the Andes of Bolivia. And the lowest point in between the Andean chains, you actually have shadow deserts, because all the water falls in the mountains, and the deserts, the valleys in between are super dry. And the valley here was, the bottom of the valley was 12,000 feet. And this is really difficult for flying because the air is so thin that the motor doesn't have much power and the wing doesn't have much to hold on to. So I enlisted Franz Schilter, who you see on the left. He was a world champion pilot. Here he's testing on a new wing. I got a wing that was like double the normal size. I also got a motor that was double the size. The motor I had on my back was a 310cc motor. They call it a Monster. And this is me getting ready to take off with the Monster. And Franz snapped this picture. He helped me because I didn't know I wanted to find somebody who was really expert because no one ever flown this high before. And this is kind of like, he didn't know if this would be the last picture taken of George. And I'm sorry to say that Franz died last month in a paragliding accident. And it was kind of a reminder that paragliding he's a wonderful guy, but it's a dangerous game. And it's one of the reasons I only fly when I want to take pictures, and people like Franz help me keep it safe or reasonably safe. But after takeoff from the Solar, we saw these really beautiful, the lakes that were coming in from the Andes on the edge of it made like a big mirrored lake, but the lake was only like 6 inches deep. And after being at 12,000 feet, I wanted to go up and look at Laguna Colorada, which is at 14,000, and because it had endemic flamingos on it. And 12,000 was tough, but 14,000 foot takeoff was even tougher. And then to take this photo, I was flying right over buzzing the flamingos are taking off in front of me, hands off the controls of the aircraft. It was really hairball. This is the most scary photograph I've ever taken. But I was really determined because nobody had ever seen these flamingos up close before. They're usually, nesting like miles from the shore. And I was just really determined to capture this really rare form of wildlife. And the lake is orange because there are volcanic waters that create an algae bloom, and then the flamingos live off the animals that live off the algae. It's a whole food chain. Anyway, in Namibia, you have these really odd fairy circles. It's in a hyper-arid region also, and the zebra graze in the grasses between the fairy circles. And I was able to actually herd the animals with my glider. And in the Sahara, we came across a lot of rock art. It made me start thinking about how the Sahara used to be a wetter place, and started making me, even in hyper-arid regions, more aware of our changing climate. And it was really strange to see, pictures of animals like giraffes and crocodiles out in the middle of the Sahara. And maybe they say about 4,000 years ago, the Sahara was largely a savanna, and it's quite, I don't know. And now I think it's actually getting wetter again. It's turning back towards a savanna. And so after finishing the work on deserts, I started getting work doing environmental stories. And I did a project for the Geographic on rising sea levels. This is in the Netherlands. It's an area that was mined for peat, and now it became flooded. And people use it little islands for vacation homes. And about 30 or 40% of the Netherlands has been reclaimed from the sea. And it's quite obvious in Flevoland, where they have windmills to help power the pumps that pump the water out. And this is in the Maldives, taken from a plane, not a paraglider. And the Maldives is a chain of atolls. And as Darwin theorized, the atolls are actually they're actually volcanoes that sank because of isostasy. They sank on the seafloor, and as they sank, what you see at the outside of the atoll is the furthest. It was the old shoreline of the volcano as it started to sink, and as it sank, the coral reef grew up. Does that make sense? The coral ripped through the water. Chris knows this stuff. But what was really sad was when you go to the capital, to Male, and you see this is basically they killed the atoll. And when you build a city on top of an atoll, it's doomed. And so Male is basically it's just sinking. And they're building up the walls, but it's like building up a bathtub ring on a sinking island. And pretty soon the water starts leaking up inside, and you have to be pumping the water out. So they're doomed. And so the atolls they can continue, but as soon as you develop them, you're basically you're dooming them to sinking. Sorry, a bit of a long story. I also went to Greenland to look at how the Greenland ice sheet is melting. And here they're putting dyes in a moulin. This is how the surface water drains and it goes down a hole to the bottom of the glacier. And they were trying to see how fast the water was flowing. And then also see where the dye came out in the sea. This is up in Sonoma after the fires in Roselle Park. And I was looking at, the extreme weather events like fires, and this is the floods in Houston when they had the biggest rain event that had ever happened in United States history. I think it was raining 18 inches a day for a couple of days. After photographing different stories for the Geographic, I was offered an assignment about food. And they were doing a story they were calling Feeding 9 Billion, how we're going to meet the future food demands of humanity. And the experts at the time were guessing that by the year 2050, we're going to have to double the global food supply to keep up with increasing demand. And part of that is rising population, but the bigger issue is changing dietary habits in the developing world. And people in countries like China that's with rapidly increasing incomes, they want to have more protein in their diet. They want to have a diet more similar to the United States, even though now the Chinese only eat half as much protein per capita as we eat here. They want to have a diet more like ours. And so the first place I was sent was to Kansas to look at the wheat harvest. This is the Volgamore family farm outside of Scott City. And Brian Volgamore is a very successful farmer. He's the most successful farmer in his county. And he's really good because he has GPS. He runs his farm like a scientific experiment. In every one of his combines, he had GPS and real-time reporting about what his yield was per square foot on a map, and he knew exactly what kind of wheat he had planted and the way he had planted it, how much fertilizer, what the weather had been. And so every year he could get higher and higher yield. So most of his neighbors realized they were a little better off renting their land to Brian to farm for them. And he was so big that he had his own airstrip and his own airplane so we could see when it was time to harvest his fields. And one day it was too windy. Brian lent me his plane to go look around. And so I was cruising around and came across this feedlot. And I go, ooh, that's pretty interesting. I can see how they're actually creating fodder for the feedlot. And it was really cool because they had white dairy cows that showed up against the manure of the feedlot. So I thought, oh, this is great, but Brian's plane's too fast. I need to come back with my paraglider. So the next morning I came back and I took off from like the corner of one of these little crop circles. And I was flying over the feedlot taking this photo. And my flight assistant came on the radio and he said, George, there's the feedlot owner's down here and he's kind of upset. He wants to know what you're doing. I said, well, Zhang Wei, tell him I'm working on an assignment for National Geographic and I can come down and talk to him about half an hour. And he goes, no, he wants you to come down right now. And if you don't come down right now, he's going to call the sheriff. And I said, it's a free country. He wants to call the sheriff. Tell him to call the sheriff. I spent the better part of the day in the Finney County Jail with Zhang Wei. And Zhang Wei was a Chinese paraglider pilot who he took me around China and I decided to take him around America and he was not amused. I wasn't particularly amused either. I was kind of annoyed because they confiscated my car, my camera, my aircraft, and when I finally got my car back, I had to go my car to get some money to pay bail in cash, and they were going through with rubber gloves, thinking they were finding Charles Manson's axe there or something. And when I got when I posted bail, I asked for a copy of the statute, and I had been arrested for criminal trespass. And it wasn't for flying over the feedlot. They said that I had actually, it turned out that the little corner that I had taken off was owned, the crop circle corner was actually owned by the feedlot, and that by running across the land, I had trespassed in their land, which was not a very reasonable charge because there was no keep out sign, there was no fence, there was no gate, it was just open Kansas. And but it was clear to me that they were just trying to harass somebody. And it was odd for me because I'd flown in Libya, I'd flown in Yemen, in Iran, and I've been detained, but I'd never been thrown in jail. And it's like, what were these guys trying to hide? And as a journalist, when you ask somebody a fairly straightforward question and they get weird on you, you realize, ooh, I'm onto a story here. And so I realized I had to look more closely at our food systems. And I also started doing more research, and I realized that in the United States, only 2% of the population is involved in growing food. And most people have very little idea how their food is made. And I felt we have kind of if not a legal right, kind of a natural right to know how our food is grown because we're eating this stuff. And also it has environmental consequences. And so I became a little more focused in this story. And when I ran the United States, I started documenting what is really the world's most industrialized food system. And this is a dairy cow operation near Green Bay. This is the largest heifer farm in the world. And it looks, to most people, this looks kind of like inhuman. Well, it's not inhuman, it's cows. But it's, if you talk to a dairy person, they would say that it's a very efficient operation. And it's true, they have like one of the lowest mortality rates of any dairy I visited. But it's very, I don't know, I mean, this is how we got to 2%. And I went to the largest organic grower of lettuce in the United States. This is Earthbound Farms, which is down near Salinas. And they have laser designed fields. They have this machine that goes through kind of like the Zamboni at the ice rink, but it cuts off the lettuce about a quarter inch above the ground. And they have a crew go out there with flashlights to make sure there aren't any mice in the field to get caught in the Zamboni. This is the almond harvest in California. And about 90% of America's commercial beekeepers are involved in the world's largest controlled pollination event. And California grows about 80% of the world's almonds. And as you all probably know, almonds are very thirsty crops. Every almond requires about a gallon of irrigation water. And there's not a whole lot of that in this state. There's been a huge movement to try to mechanize harvesting, but there's some crops like celery in the Salinas Valley, which is still done by hand. And I also started trying to look at solutions to some of our climate issues. And this is an experiment at the University of Arizona, where they're making a three-dimensional model of every sunflower plant in this field to try to see which were most able to withstand drought. It was 118 degrees the day I took this picture. And the second place I went after the United States, I went to Brazil, which has the fastest growing agricultural output in the world. And this is what the Amazon looks like on fire. Huge parts of the Amazon are being converted for farmland, most of it for cattle. And this is what it looks like when it's on fire in the early morning. The smoke settles in the trees. And after the smoke clears, this is what it looks like. And it's very spooky. You walk around, you go in the forest and you hear all the bird song and the monkeys and everything, and you go out where the cows are and it's just dead quiet. It's kind of a sad, sterile environment. And I went to some really, they round this is a cattle roundup in the southern Amazon. And in Brazil, they use an Indian breed called the Nelore. They're beautiful white cows. And I was able to get into the largest slaughterhouse in Brazil. This is the JBS slaughterhouse. It's really, for me as a journalist, it's really tough getting into places like this. They don't look very good, and it's very hard to convince people to let you in and not be deceitful. And it's also hard. They didn't actually see me take this picture. You have to be a little bit sneaky. Typically in slaughterhouses, I don't end up finishing the tour. They want me to delete pictures, and I refuse to delete pictures. But I try and be really fair because I want to tell. I'm not a vegan or vegetarian. I just want to show how our food is made so people can make up their own mind. In Brazil, they're also in the Amazon. A lot of the deforestation is for soybeans as well, and a lot of the soybeans are to feed pigs and chickens for export. And the road network is not very good there, so it's actually more economic to try to concentrate that protein from the soy protein into animal protein and export pigs and chickens. And this pig is stained green to prevent skin disease. This is one of the largest soybean farms in Brazil. This one was 23,000 hectares. This company, they were the biggest grower in Brazil, the biggest soybean grower in the world. They had 2,300 square miles of soybeans. And the new tariffs that we're about to put on China for agricultural products, it's music to Brazilian farmers' ears. Brazil has actually become to dominate. The U.S. used to dominate that business, and now the Brazilians are. Even though we had a better geographic position to export to China, Brazil has got really cheap land, and they've got our technology. They're using John Deere tractors and all the modern agronomy, and they're really kicking butt. It's impressive. China has become the world's largest food importer. It's really deformed the global food market. This is a crayfish eating festival in China, and crayfish were imported to China in the 1920s. And originally it was seen as a pest, but then they realized that if they put them in rice stubble fields and flooded them, that the crayfish would eat all the rice stubble and all their poo would fertilize for the next crop. And now China is the largest producer of crayfish on the planet. China has a lot of problems feeding its people because, first of all, there's increased demand. A lot of their land is difficult to farm, and it's very difficult to get combines in here to farm. This is the green is corn, and the tan is wheat, and this is during the wheat harvest. And it's a really beautiful country, but in the countryside, the kids don't want to do. It's really hard work, and the kids don't want to do it after they go to school. Most of them want to go to the city and get a factory job. They also have a lot of problems with pollution. This is an area they've been over-fertilized, and the lake had become sterile because of an algal bloom that took all the oxygen out of the water. In China, there's also been a lot of consolidation of farming. They've had a lot of problems with food safety, like contaminated baby formula, et cetera. And so they started to consolidate the operations, and this is one of the biggest chicken plants. This supplies all the fast food chains, this one factory. They also have the biggest pig slaughterhouse in the world. This pig slaughterhouse I think there were 1,200 workers on the factory floor. It was really tough. It's really tough, getting into these places. And this one, they actually had a little walkway for their vendors to go along. And when it showed up unannounced and walked in and started taking pictures of the glass, and then I went back to the manager and said, geez, it's a great looking factory, but it looks kind of crummy through the dirty glass. Could I come back on Monday? And lo and behold, they let me in. It's really nice. As China is probably growing on the land, they started to move to the sea to feed their people. And China has the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world. And this is Shipu Harbor when there are 2,000 boats about to set sail. And China heavily subsidizes its fishing fleet, both the building of the vessels as well as subsidizing the fuel. And they also have a lot of, I explained, they had problems with food safety. And when you raise a sea cucumber in pens near commercial drilling rigs, you're going to obviously have some pollution in the sea cucumbers. They're filter feeders, and they're going to be consolidating a lot of the toxic stuff out of the oil rigs. So it was just to me, I didn't go there. I was there to get pictures. I'm not going out there to test the water, but you just see a lot of things that are kind of obviously hazardous as you go around. And when I was going around the coast, I saw a lot of fish farms, and I looked at the bags and saw where the fish meal came from, and most of it came from Peru. And this is the Peruvian anchovy fleet. The anchoveta is the biggest fishery by volume in the world, and China is the biggest buyer. And most people think when they think about overfishing, they think of like big industrial boats, and those are a big issue. But there's also issues with small artisanal boats. This is in the coast of Mauritania, where you have thousands of small-scale fishermen going out to sea in open boats to get pilchards. In the north of Mauritania, they've got a big octopus fleet, and this is during the octopus breeding season when all the boats are back in harbor. And as I was looking at different food systems, I feel like, well, I had chickens, I had pigs, I had cows, and I thought that was enough to kind of have the biggest example of each kind of food. And then I realized it was interesting to looking at comparative food systems. And this is the biggest sugar plantation in Brazil. These guys have 30,000 hectares of cane. But I looked at the data and I said, no, but actually India is bigger in sugar production. It's just not for export. And this is what an Indian production looks like. In India, it's illegal to own more than 10 hectares of land if it's non-irrigated, 5,000 if it's irrigated. So you have all these small-scale farmers who go out and cut their own cane, and then they bring it up in their little tractor. They have an app, and they find out what day they're supposed to show up at the factory and have their little tractor full, and they show up. But it was similar food, but totally different system. I also looked at coffee. This is coffee production in Brazil. Brazil has 40% of the global coffee market. And typically, coffee is grown as a shade plant in kind of a degraded forest, but they've figured out a variety of coffee that can grow out in the open. And so they can machine harvest it. And that little red dot you see, that's the machine harvester. It drives over the bushes with little fingers that pull all the beans off. Super efficient and very low cost. But coffee originated in Ethiopia. This is one of the biggest growers in Ethiopia. These are their drying racks. And they cover it up in the night so it doesn't get dewy. And then they're opening it up again in the morning. And the ladies here were making $2 a day. And this was the highest paying coffee plantation in Ethiopia. These ladies were delighted to be working here. I also wanted to look more in depth at cattle, since they're responsible for a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the Nelore cattle that you saw in Brazil, but their system is totally different from what you find in Australia. In Australia, they have free-range cattle that are left basically in a feral condition for about 11 months a year, and then they have to go and round them up by helicopter, and then they herd them in on horseback, and these gals are all coming in for a fertility test. And here are in their pens waiting for their test. And they take the young males and they separate them from their mothers. Anyway, this is an American feedlot. This is in Happy, Texas. And the American feedlot system is quite unique. The American feedlot system has been able to actually double the amount of beef we can produce in the United States with the same number of cows, which is really quite extraordinary. And they've done that by most of the cows, they go to the feedlot when they're a year old, and within 6 months they double weight by giving them a lot of corn products. And those guys on horseback, they're pen riders, and they go in and check on every single cow of the 150,000 that are there every day. Very efficient operation. And then they go to the Tyson slaughterhouse in Amarillo. And at the time I took this photo, it was actually illegal to take pictures of animal operations in Texas with the drone. And I just think it's really problematic. Like you go to the market and you see, you go and you get your steak and it's a little foam tray with a barcode and cellophane, and you have no idea how it was produced. And that's a big part of what my project is about, is trying to kind of break down those barriers. And I'm not telling people like, you should be a vegan or vegetarian, because I'm an omnivore. I just think people should know how their food's produced so they can make an informed decision what they want to do. This is cattle production. I went back to South Sudan to the same Dinka cattle camps I went to as a Stanford dropout. And this is what they look like from my paraglider. And this is what they look like on the ground. And they're still exactly the same. They're still naked in the cattle camps. And this young boy he wanted to get a fresh snack of milk. It was also interesting looking at dairy operations in the Swiss Alps. The Swiss Alps would be forested much like the Rocky Mountains if it wasn't for the subsidies given to them by the Swiss government. About 80% of the farmers I saw there, the herders, were about 80% of their income was government subsidies. But they love their cows, and when they bring them down at the end of the summer, they dress them up, they comb them, and they put these little strange little hats and bells on them. It was like a coming out party. It was really amazing. And they're all like, they weren't yodeling, but it was almost, it was really extraordinary. And to bring the sheep down from the Alps, they had to, because of the changing climate, they couldn't walk across the glacier anymore. They had to blast this route out, and the sheep come down this really circuitous path to get down to where they started at the beginning of the summer. And this is most of the Parmesan cheese you've ever had in your life came out of this one warehouse in Parma, and it's been about a year there. And even in Europe, where you have a lot of artisanal systems, there are still certain nodes where you would find mega systems of agriculture. And the biggest dairy operation in the world is actually in India. And this is Banas Dairy, and it's a cooperative of 450,000 small-scale farmers. And typically they would have like 2 to 5 cows and buffalo, and they milk them by hand. And then the ladies all bring the milk to the local co-op. And there it gets filtered and chilled and put on a truck to Banas Dairy, where it gets turned into yogurt, and they even have a milk train that takes it to Delhi. And they even gather all the manure, and they turn it into gas to fuel the cars. So I've spent about 10 years looking at food systems, and I finished my book came out in the fall, and I decided to start on a new project. It's kind of a branch out from that. And I was looking for 10 years. I started looking at how we're going to meet the future food demands of humanity. I started thinking, like, how are we going to meet all the other demands of 10 billion people? Like, how are we going to, if everybody in the world, they say if everybody in the world wants to have a lifestyle like we have in the United States, we need 4 or 5 Earths. And how are we going to create all those resources? And so this is in China, which is China has become a major power in green energy. And they're trying to, their energy demand is going up so fast that even though they're ramping up green energy, their use of coal is still very high. This is a coal sorting yard in China, but they're doing a lot of the green energy. They're being really aggressive in developing nuclear and solar and wind power. And this is a solar field out near Golmud in the Tibetan Plateau, an active dune field. You can also see the growing demand for population in this rural village in Poland. This is a system called I think it's called Walden, Waldhoofendorf. And these are road villages where everybody was given a little plot along the road, and they followed the topography out to the forest. But because of inheritance, the strips have gotten narrower and narrower, and the forest has all disappeared because of the demands for food for everyone. And this was taken in February. This is the world's largest gathering of humanity. This is the Maha Kumela. The day I took this picture, there were 57 million Indians who would come for this one festival. It's the biggest Hindu gathering in 144 years. And they had a lot of, actually they had some stampedes, people got crushed, but this is the police trying to herd people back onto the trains at the end of the festival. And on Sunday I got back from Dubai, and I was looking at energy use in Dubai. Dubai has one of the highest energy uses per capita in the world, about twice that of the United States. And it's a really interesting futuristic city built on tourism. This is a new infinity pool in the center of the Palm Jumeirah. And to fuel all that, they have the biggest gas power plant in the world. It covers 3 kilometers of the coast. It also provides all their water. Like 90% of the country's water comes out of this one plant. So it may be kind of an ugly plant, but without this, Dubai would not exist. And they're also built the world's largest, but they're actually trying to reduce their energy footprint. And they built one of the biggest solar farms in the world. And this one solar park, this is a concentrated solar plant, and that tower is 900 feet tall, and it provides energy for 800,000 homes. And so it was really interesting to see a country like this, kind of you would think is like the most profitable, user of energy, is actually trying to ramp theirs down. And it seems like a good model for a country like ours. But that's the last picture I have today. Thank you.
Let me start with a question that goes back to your geophysics days. How the heck did you find a lot of those places, like the caldera in Libya or the dune system in Yemen? What?
Stanford, it fosters curiosity, and I'm a curious person. In Africa, I was interested in like Swahili and French and Arabic, and I'm just always I'm curious about stuff. And I'd be poring over maps and looking for oddities, and I would go I used to go to, when I was in Paris, I'd go to the French Institute of Geography and get these really old colonial maps and find really weird landforms on them and weird stuff. And you talk to people, and I don't know, I'm a digger, and I just like to find. You start looking. When I started getting interested in deserts, I started going to the library and buying books on deserts and looking through. I went to see Theodore Monod, the great desert explorer in Paris before he died, and he let me paw through his library, and I found cool stuff. And I'm always kind of looking and trying to find interesting stuff.
Can I extend that to the food and now the renewable energy thing? How do you pick where in the food system you want to probe, or in the renewable energy system?
Well, with food, I started with food, and I grew up in LA. I didn't know anything about food. I'm not a farmer. And I just found, when I started looking at it, I realized that there were when I met Brian Volgamore and he explained his scientific approach to farming, I go, wow, I never thought of that. And most people think big farmers are they're taking advantage of people, and it's no, these guys are really good at their game. That's why they got big. And it was how do they do that? How does he do what he does? And I just started asking a lot of questions, and then I'd hear about one sugar mill, and I go and talk to somebody else, and they say if you want to see a really good one, you go here, and it just one thing leads to another. I find when I get onto a good topic, it just opens up all these doors. And so with deserts, I fascinated with deserts, and I realized I got a map of all the world's extreme deserts. I found these maps that show global rainfall, and I realized, for example, that Antarctica is a desert. And most people don't think of it that way, but it's just a frozen desert. There's a lot of ice there, but it's because there's precip, there's a little precip, but it never really evaporates.
It's too cold to snow.
Yeah, it's too cold to snow, I said, well, geez, how can I photograph Antarctica so it looks like a desert? And I wrote a pitch to the NSF saying I wanted to photograph the frozen desert, and they gave me 10 weeks of time down there to go and explore their desert. And so it gives me a field like deserts or food, or now sustainability, it gives me like a lens to look at the world, and it leads me to interesting stuff and good stories.
Let me ask just a couple of questions about the artistic vision. One of the things that really strikes me about your photos is how often you use geometry, and they're repeated patterns with deviations that sort of say, this not as regular as you thought. And for some, like the ones of the combines, are staggeringly regular. How do you think about using geometry and scale in making an image?
The geometry is just it's kind of instinctual. That's how I guess it's how I see. But scale is really important. And like when I was doing paragliding, I would usually go. One of the reasons I went with another pro pilot is often I would use them for scale, because I would see like some really amazing dune pattern, but you had no idea how big it was. So I'd get like Franz or Alain out there to fly for me, and I would tell them on the radio, get a little lower, and I would see that glider, and all of a sudden you say, wow, that's a huge dune. And scale, and in agriculture, scale was super important. Hopefully, you usually go there during harvest time, so you have something, the size of for an element. Or like I just showed a picture tonight of Lake Natron, all the red patterns, and if you didn't have that little plane shadow, you have no idea what you're looking at. And so scale is really critical. And I love photographing big stuff, like something like the world's biggest gets me excited. But you need to see something for scale to make it work, and it's really key. But you have to do it I try and do it in an elegant or a subtle way.
One of the things that's striking about the world's biggest is you talked about the world's biggest both with industrial agriculture and with artisanal agriculture. And what are you trying to communicate in that juxtaposition?
Well, with artisanal, it was like I wanted to look at the scale of the problem we were fishing. And I went out with like some of the artisanal boats, and one of those boats out in the middle of the ocean was not a great picture. I did that. I spent a day out there with those guys, and it was nasty, bobbing in the ocean with them, smelling like sardines all day. But it wasn't. I'll do that for a picture. I'll dive under an oil rig in Egypt for a picture, but it wasn't an interesting picture. And so I realized, I needed to have a lot of boats. So I started saying, where can I find a lot of boats? So I started looking at. Somebody told me to go to the coast of West Africa, and I went down with Google Earth. I went down the whole freaking coast of West Africa in every port looking for boats. And I said, ooh, that's why I found those octopus boats. I found that on Google Earth. Wow. And unfortunately for me, that port is right in the approach for the international runway of that town. And so it was really nasty with my drone. And fortunately, they hadn't registered the airport with DJI, the drone maker, so it actually would fly there. But I was really worried about hitting a plane or a plane hitting my drone. So I went to the airport in the morning, and there were these guys. They're like two guys who carried the baggage. That was their job, was carrying the baggage off the planes. And I asked them when the planes came in. They said, oh, there's one in at 9:30. And so I flew until 9:15, and then I brought my drone down. Here comes the jet, and then back up I went. But you have to find you always have to find like a little way to make things happen. But it's a lot of research, and I spend about 40% of my time in the field, and the rest of the time I was doing research, trying to find the right thing or the right access, and trying to find the right story.
Let me just ask a couple questions about the sustainability theme, and then we'll open it to everybody else. One of the striking things, if you look at global agriculture production, is that the average yield per acre from industrial ag is about the same as the average yield per acre from subsistence ag. The main difference is how many people it takes to do the production. And do you feel like in your messages about moving to sustainable food systems, you're putting a hand on the scale in terms of favoring one approach or the other?
No, I think the reality is that things are moving towards mechanized systems. And almost everywhere I went, you would see, even in the developing world, you see people abandoning peasant rural agriculture because it's tough work, and the kids don't want to do it. And I'm not telling them not to do it. That's the story. And in Yunnan, where they have the world's biggest rice terraces, it's 1,000 meters of vertical rice terraces. It's gorgeous. It's a World Heritage Site for agriculture. But about 30% of them are fallow because the kids don't want to do it, and the old people are getting too old, and it's just really tough work. And you find that almost everywhere. And so it's not. That's I mean, in the U.S. and the industrialized world, we're at 2%. In India, it's like, I don't know, it's more like, I think it's like 60% of the population are farmers. but they only make about 30% of the income, which is why they're trapped in poverty. And because of those small plots of land, they can't sell their land. Like they might buy a tractor and go bankrupt. They can't sell their land and get a bankruptcy. And so they're trapped in poverty. But you find that trend of consolidation is really quite universal. It's present in Europe too, even there's all this protectionism to preserve the family farm and the artisanal way of making food. But those things are not so economic unless they're high priced commodities.
I think that's right. I think that's the story around the world of agriculture is that A, it's hard work. B, you have to get up super early in the morning and make any money.
Yeah, and I see these old guys in Yunnan out on the rice terraces with their buffalo, and they're up to their butt in the mud in the morning, and it's hard work, and they're arthritic, and they're sitting there like doing it, and it's brutal.
One fact I came across recently that really struck me is that something like 80% of all mammal biomass on the planet is either humans or cattle, and I was impressed that your pictures are mostly humans and cattle is what you see.
Yeah, actually, a more striking statistic to me was that the total biomass of domesticated chickens is greater than all the wild birds in the world combined. And it's kind of a sign of how far we've gone and what the scientists are calling, or trying to call, the Anthropocene. And it's just, we're so deformed the natural world. They say that actually chicken bones are a marker for the Anthropocene, because you go in almost any landfill anywhere in the world, even like, in Nigeria, and you'll find the late 20th century, you'll find the chicken bone layer.
Do you think that as images get easier and easier to make, they'll start to lose their power?
They certainly have lost their value. I can tell you economically. I mean, I came up in the magazine business, and the magazine business is almost kaput. And a lot of it's because of the phone. It's so, a monkey can take a good picture with a phone. And it used to be with film, like when my mother was telling me all my terrible, photo reports, that it was really difficult to take a good picture with Kodachrome in the middle of the day. And now with an iPhone, it's just like, it's like auto white balance, auto everything. And it's just, and everybody's a photographer. But a really great photo is still really valuable. It's just there's a lot more competition than there used to be because everybody's got a phone. So.
Yes, I have a question about the slaughterhouses that you took pictures of and so forth. I was under the impression that I think the people ethical treatment of animals have been kicked out of taking pictures of slaughterhouses and things like that. How did you get in? And did any of the things you see or saw or take photos of make you think about the cruelty to animal slaughtering?
I didn't really witness any animal cruelty, and I tried to get into slaughterhouse in the U.S. and I was not successful. It was a wake-up call to me in Garden City that they wouldn't let me photograph in a feedlot, and so I started thinking like, I think I need to try doing this in like kind of developing countries. I'd have better luck, and it was true. Like I go to like the like these big operations in Brazil, and I'd say like, wow, like how do you guys whack 30,000 pigs a day? That's amazing. How do you? And they go, oh, we'll show you. And we have the latest stuff from Des Moines, and they show me the stuff. And so I was able. They were more open, and same in China. They were quite open, and so that was the way in for me, was going to the developing world to photograph that stuff. And they would have virtually the same system. In many cases, it'd be more modern systems because they started later, so they would be getting the newest stuff rather than trying to, you go to the Tyson slaughterhouse in Amarillo. I think they actually redid it after COVID, but for a long time it was the same old thing, and now it's automated. And they're trying to make those systems so that you don't need people in them. But there's so many different kinds of cows that it's difficult. Like I went to a big salmon farm in Norway, and then they have robots heading and gutting all the fish because they're genetically identical, and they're all exactly the same size. And so it's just like the fish just come in. They come in tubes, and they just get whacked, and they come out as fillets and frozen. It's really amazing. No people. But I didn't see, in terms of animal abuse, I saw a lot of, I would look at how they kill the animals, and I'm not an advocate for the slaughterhouse industry, but I didn't see cruelty. It's not really in their interest to be doing that. The animals, it changes, like for the meat, it changes the taste because there's a stress in the animal, and they don't really want to be doing that. Generally, the pig slaughterhouses, the pigs know what's going on, and there's a lot of squealing, and it's pretty disturbing. But the pig and the chicken the chicken and the beef slaughterhouses, we went to a buffalo slaughterhouse in India, and I didn't really see much sign of stress from the animals. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but the ones I went to, I didn't see it. And I'm not going in, coming in with a flashlight at night. I'm coming in the front door, and so there could be the ones the PETA guys trying to break into, but I don't want to do that kind of journalism. It's not what I do. So.
Can I follow up with a quick question? It seems like the messaging in your photos is really open to the viewer's interpretation. Do you explicitly try to say, here's a viewpoint, but there are lots of ways you could think about this?
Or I just try to present the information, and I try to be really factual and unbiased. You can be factual and biased, but and you only print one side. But I try to just say how they do what they do, and if I'm playing it right, the slaughterhouse people would want to use that picture in their brochure, and the PETA people want to use it in their brochure too. And that, to me, if I'm playing it that way, I'm doing my job right. And I think, to me, when you present this information, the logical, from a sustainability standpoint, the logical conclusion to me, my personal takeaway, is that we all need to eat less meat, because you can't tell people like in China that they can't eat as much as we do, and so maybe the solution is for us all to eat a little less meat and live a little lighter on the earth. But that's and I'm not telling people what to think, but that was what my personal takeaway was.
Thanks so much for this presentation. Photography is a deeply visual activity, both for the photographer and for the viewer. But the paraglider was very loud in the video we played. So I'm curious to get your sense of, in the visual activity that you engage in, you have the sensual hearing and smelling, I presume, in some occasions. How does the other senses affect your work at all?
How does the other senses? I mean, how does like audio, for example?
Yeah, but when it's so loud in the air, you don't have a moment of peace, at least.
Well, when I'm flying, I've got a radio headset on, so it's not quite so loud. And it is a little. I mean, it's basically it's a motorcycle engine on your back, and there's not a big muffler. Everything's super light, and so it is a bit of a racket. And I found the animals would flee generally. The camels wouldn't. Camels are too tired carrying the salt, but like wild animals will flee. And so I realized that was, as a photographer, I learned you use whatever asset you have. If it's a problem, you try and turn an asset. And so they're running from me. I said, oh, I can hurt them. And so I would go and round up all the zebras, and they go running across the fairy circles. And I don't want to, in that environment, you don't want to stress the animals because it's still a desert environment. If they run too far, it's hard for them to replenish their water. So you don't want to, be nasty to the animals, but you can, I'll get them together and make it an asset. And I also found, like for the glider, I used it to get into a lot of places. Like remember, like I was in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and I would go out, like I could land in front of a police post. Instead of getting arrested, they invite me in for dinner, because I was like the adventure dude. And so, you use that. It was a real icebreaker. In African villages, you land in a red parachute in front of somebody's house, and you're good for dinner. You're in. You're the hero. And so it really opened up a lot of doors to me. And even in Iran, I wasn't the spy, I was the adventure dude. And I had a team with me. It was funny, we traveled for 6 weeks in Iran. I kept getting putting under house arrest. I wasn't like Garden City, but I was just like detained. But I had this team with me, and the song of the trip became Mission Impossible. Every time we saw a police checkpoint, they went Mission Impossible on the radio. Because it was like they were my team and they were on my side because I was the adventure guy, and you use that as an asset. So.
It was a fascinating talk. Thank you. A lot of the pictures make you wonder how there could possibly be a fish left in the ocean or a shred of grass left in that area where it's feeding animals. We always talk about sustainability, and I'm curious how often you've run across a situation where humans in a landscape seem to be living in a way that actually is today sustainable.
Well, the problem, one of the challenges of sustainability is when you have a shared resource, like the ocean, or it's kind of like we have a problem with our atmosphere. Everybody thinks they can pump carbon into the atmosphere. Nobody owns the atmosphere. When you have a lake, people living on a lake, and they own the whole lake, they'll take care of the fish in that lake. Because all of a sudden they start taking too many out, and all of a sudden there's no more fish, and they own it. But it's the shared resource that tends to be the problem. They call it, what is it, the tragedy of the commons. And so And it's the same thing. I mean, generally, like most farmers, they want to preserve their soil. They love farming, and they want their kids to be able to take over and farm the land. And so they don't want to damage their soil. But they could be desperate. Also, they could be a bad farmer and not know what they're doing and not realizing the damage. But it's not in their incentive since they own the land to damage it. Generally those problems like you see that with the fisheries, it's the fishermen don't think they own the ocean. So.
Could you say a little more about how you think about the relationship you need to develop with the people before you get the picture? The sense of the commitment of the farmers, where does that come from?
Well, you have to go and talk to them. I like to hear their story, and I ask a lot of questions, and friendly questions. But it's kind of like, how do you do that? And you try to get their confidence, understand, their story. I try to get it. I don't want to get too down in the weeds. I'm not an agronomist. I just want to understand the basics so I can write a caption. But you get their confidence, and they tell you their story. And sometimes they say, oh, you think that's interesting? You should go down the road and see this guy.
And so inspired your adventures across the country, so right out of college, but out learning the language and things like that. I was wondering, do you have any practical advice in hindsight for people who are interested in doing the same?
You just go out and I mean, I think it's a little bit different. Like in Africa at the time, there weren't a lot of women doing what I was doing. There weren't a whole lot of guys either. It's kind of an oddity out there. But it would be more. I wouldn't advise a woman to do what I was doing in that time in Africa. You'd be alone, and I just don't think you'd have some bad experiences. But that's that particular point in place and time. But in general, I just think you have to go out and or they grab the bull by the horns or whatever it is,
But be careful while you're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's like, I'm not a risk taker, I'm a risk manager. And you go and you have to try and figure out what's reasonable and talk to people and stuff. But like my mother told me when I went to Africa that I was gonna get hung up from a tree, but my mother had never been to Africa. And when I got into paragliding, people told me, oh, I was gonna get, I was gonna get crippled. And I said, well, have you done it? They said, no, I haven't done it. So I found people who actually did it. And they said, oh, it's reasonable if you do it early in the morning and late in the day when the air is calm. And if you check your motor, you do this, that. And so I did all those things, and it was okay. But you have to suss it out and ask a lot of questions. And be curious.
Do you get to share your aerial images with people who live,
I do get to, now with drones and phones and stuff, I can share pictures. With film, I couldn't. And that's the really nice thing, is to be able to go and actually with the drone, I'll actually go up to the farmer and actually show them what I'm doing. And it's really helpful for confidence if they're skeptical that I'm trying to do something nefarious. But I really like doing that. And I'll even send them a picture of their farm as a thank you. And it's a really nice way to make friends.
How the changes in technology, like from paraglider to drone, has changed the way that you do your photography?
Well, the drones have let me, I actually prefer the drone to the glider now. And part of it, I'm 67 years old. It's a lot easier to do it with the drone. But it gives me a lot more control. With the glider, you're always moving. And there's a lot of vibration and noise. And I can't fly in a lot of areas because it's too dangerous in case there's a motor problem. So the drone is really, like I can fly off the back of a boat with the drone. And it just opens up a whole lot of things that are really exciting. I can also fly with a drone. I can go in really dim light, like half-second exposures, and get sharp pictures. And so that's really, I love working with that. My studio manager has worked for me for a long time, and she can't tell the difference between the film pictures or the paraglider pictures and the drone pictures. For her, they're all George pictures, and it's really the same head seeing the world in the same way. It just the drone lets me go a little lower and closer, and a little slower. And it's also a little quieter too, so I can be a little sneaky sometimes if I have to be sneaky.
What is your next project?
I'm working on a new project about basically it's kind of about sustainability, how we're going to meet the future demands of humanity, not just in food but in other things like energy and dealing with waste. And I want to look at kind of the impacts of the developing world on the planet. And so it's kind of like an extension of what I did on food, but looking at other resources. And then I just started that a few weeks ago when I was in India and Dubai. And I want to work on that for the next few years. I'm planning on going to China in May. And China's interesting. It has a shrinking population, and they're moving towards green energy, and I want to look at those issues. So it's that kind of stuff. It's really still kind of looking at sustainability issues, but mostly in the developing world and in the US as well.
I think all the photos that you showed were in using variable wavelengths. And I wondered if you've experimented at all with multispectral cameras, or you have any interest in sort of seeing what's there that we don't see and showing.
It'd be interesting to do. I haven't played around with those. The ones I've heard about, some of them, like the drones that I fly, DJI drones, they have like infrared sensors, but they're usually, most ones I know of are not super high resolution, and it's kind of grainy. So you'd have kind of like a grainy black and white photo, and I've played around with some projects in the past with it, and I think it'd be interesting to look at like certain kinds of like animal behavior at night. You could see like certain things be interesting, but I haven't looked at that. It's a good idea, and it'd be interesting to see like for energy, looking at like heat signatures would be really interesting. It's a good idea.
Thank you for your beautiful work. I'm curious, with everything you've served all these years, are you left with more or less hope for humanity and the planet?
More. I think I had an editor once at National Geographic who wanted me to do a story about the end of cheap oil. And Dennis is a lovely guy, but he didn't really understand the oil business. He felt it was like oil was like the tank in your car, and when it's out, it's out. And the reality with the oil business is the more expensive oil is, the more there is to find. And I think, nobody ever saw fracking coming along. And all of a sudden now there's more cheap oil than anybody could have imagined. And when I was working on food, I went to like some agricultural research institutes where they would have like ancient seeds and find out how unproductive some of these old crops were. And you look at how far we've come, the productivity we've gained, and the green revolution, and how many more people we were able to feed with that revolution. I don't think we've reached the limit of what's possible. And I think anybody who bets against the creativity of humanity is a fool. And I think, and now with AI, it's like, oh my God, with these new tools, who could have imagined this stuff coming along? I could never imagine drones. I mean, a remote control camera. Yeah, I sit there in the car and get a high res picture, like a 45 megapixel picture of us sitting in a car. That's crazy. So who knows what the future will bring? But I just think that the creativity of humanity is just, it's I wouldn't say it's unlimited, but it hasn't really been tapped.
But you were pretty emphatic about less meat.
That seems logical to me, that right, with the current level of technology and people that we got to feed, I don't see, a lot of the oceans are getting emptied out, that we've deformed the food chains in the ocean. And there aren't a whole lot of swordfish left, a lot of big fish are gone. And you see there's a proliferation of jellyfish because there aren't things to eat them anymore. And there's just, we've really deformed food chains. So I think that's a logical solution at this time.
Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful conversation.